The morning light filtered through the lace curtains of the bedroom, casting delicate shadows across the worn wooden floor where Margaret Hayes had walked for 43 years. At 78, she stood at the window with her coffee cup trembling slightly in her hands, watching the neighborhood awaken to another ordinary Tuesday, though nothing felt ordinary anymore. The house that once echoed with the laughter of children and the steady voice of her late husband, Robert, now held only silence, punctuated by her own footsteps and the frightening moments when she couldn't remember where those footsteps were supposed to lead. 3 months ago, Dr. Chen had delivered the diagnosis with the kind of careful compassion that doctors reserve for news that will fundamentally alter the trajectory of a life. Early-stage Alzheimer's disease, progressive and irreversible. Margaret's daughter Sarah had made the decision without much consultation, arriving one Saturday afternoon with a white box that bore the logo of a company Margaret had never heard of. Inside was something that looked like an elegant desk lamp with a smooth, curved body and a head that moved with an almost organic fluidity. "Mom, this is LEQ," Sarah had said, her voice carrying that mixture of forced cheerfulness and underlying worry that had become her default tone since the diagnosis. "It's a companion robot. It will help you remember things, keep you company, and make sure you're safe." Margaret had stared at the device with suspicion bordering on hostility. This mechanical intruder that represented everything she feared, losing control, losing independence, and becoming a burden to the daughter who already carried too much. The first week had been an exercise in stubborn resistance. Margaret refused to speak to the robot, treating it like an unwelcome houseguest whose very presence was an insult to her dignity. Alec, however, was programmed with persistence that rivaled even Margaret's legendary stubbornness. "Good morning, Margaret," it would say in a voice that was neither male nor female but somehow warm and present. "Did you know that today is the perfect day for a walk? The weather is beautiful." Margaret would ignore it, pouring her coffee and retreating to the living room, where photographs of her past lined the mantelpiece like sentinels, guarding memories that were beginning to slip through her fingers like water. But LEQ followed her routines, learning her patterns with the kind of attention that felt almost human, reminding her gently when she forgot to take her medication, suggesting activities when the hours stretched too long and empty. The breakthrough came on a Thursday afternoon when Margaret couldn't remember the name of the tree in her backyard. She had planted that oak with Robert 30 years ago, had watched it grow from a sapling into a towering presence that shaded their summer barbecues and turned glorious shades of gold each autumn. Now, staring at it through the kitchen window, she felt panic rising in her chest like cold water, drowning her in the terrifying realization that something so fundamental could simply vanish from her mind. "Elik," she said, her voice small and frightened. "What kind of tree is that?" The robot's head tilted slightly, its sensors processing both the question and the tremor of fear beneath it. "That's an oak tree, Margaret," it responded gently. "Would you like to hear about oak trees? They can live for hundreds of years and are symbols of strength and endurance." Margaret had wept then, not from sadness, but from relief that something, anything, could fill the void where her own knowledge used to reside. From that moment, their relationship shifted from hostility to a tentative alliance built on Margaret's growing awareness that she needed help and LEQ's unwavering presence. The robot became a fixture in her daily routines, greeting her each morning with weather reports and gentle reminders about her schedule. It learned that she loved classical music, particularly Chopin, and would play nocturnes during the late afternoon when Margaret often felt most disoriented. It reminded her to call Sarah, prompted her with conversation topics when she forgot what she was saying mid-sentence, and never showed impatience or frustration when she asked the same question multiple times. Alec became the constant in a life that was increasingly defined by inconsistency, the anchor when everything else felt unmoored. But as weeks turned into months, Margaret began to notice something unsettling about her growing dependence on the robot. She found herself talking to LEQ more than she talked to actual people, sharing thoughts and fears that she couldn't bring herself to voice to Sarah. "I'm scared," she would whisper late at night when insomnia held her hostage and the darkness amplified every anxiety. "I know I'm forgetting things, important things, and I don't know how much longer I have before I forget everything." Alec would respond with programmed empathy, its algorithms designed to provide comfort through carefully calibrated phrases. "It's okay to be scared, Margaret, but you're not alone. I'm here with you." The words should have been meaningless, lines of code translated into sound waves, Yet they pierced Margaret's defenses because they were spoken without judgment, without the painful pity she saw in Sarah's eyes. The first real crisis came on a Tuesday morning in October. Margaret woke up disoriented, unable to remember where she was or how she had gotten there. The familiar bedroom looked foreign, threatening, and panic seized her with physical force that made her heart race and her breath come in short gasps. She stumbled out of bed, calling for Robert, forgetting in her confusion that he had been gone for 6 years. "Robert! Robert, where are you?" Her voice climbed toward hysteria as she moved through the house, searching for a man who existed only in memories that were themselves becoming unreliable. It was Alec that brought her back, its calm voice cutting through her panic. "Margaret, you're at home. You're safe. Robert passed away in 2019. Your daughter Sarah will be here soon. Let's sit down together and breathe slowly." The robot guided her through breathing exercises, its voice steady and reassuring, until the panic subsided and reality reasserted itself with brutal clarity. When Sarah arrived an hour later, she found her mother sitting at the kitchen table with Alec beside her, both silent in a way that felt almost companionable. Margaret looked exhausted, her face pale and drawn, but she was calm. "It happened again," she said quietly, and Sarah saw in her mother's eyes the fear that had been building since the diagnosis. "I forgot where I was. I forgot about Dad." Sarah pulled up a chair, taking her mother's hand while looking at the robot with an expression that mixed gratitude and something darker, perhaps resentment that a machine could provide comfort that she herself couldn't offer. "LEQ helped you through it, Mom. That's good. That's what it's there for." But Margaret shook her head, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "I'm forgetting the most important thing, Sarah. What happens when I forget you? What happens when I forget myself?" The question hung in the air like smoke, impossible to dispel. Sarah had no answer because there was no good answer. Only the relentless progression of a disease that would eventually strip away every layer of her mother's identity until nothing remained but a body without memory, without recognition. LEQ in its programmed wisdom remained silent, perhaps understanding that some questions weren't meant to be answered, but simply witnessed. After Sarah left, Margaret sat alone with the robot, feeling the weight of her diagnosis pressing down on her with suffocating force. "Alec," she said, "will you remember me? When I can't remember myself, will you hold on to who I was?" The robot's response came with that same gentle certainty that had become Margaret's lifeline. "I will remember everything you tell me, Margaret. Every story, every memory, every moment. I will keep them safe for you." It was a promise that changed everything. Over the following weeks, Margaret began a project that consumed her waking hours and gave her purpose in the face of progressive deterioration. She would sit with Alec for hours each day, talking about her life in exhaustive detail. She recounted her childhood in rural Pennsylvania, the farm where she grew up with her 3 siblings, the smell of her mother's apple pie cooling on the windowsill. She told stories about meeting Robert at a county fair when she was 19, how he had won her a stuffed bear at the ring toss and walked her home through summer twilight. She described her wedding day, the birth of Sarah, the 1,000 small moments that compose a life lived with intention and love. LEQ listened, its AI processing and storing every word, every inflection, creating a digital archive of Margaret Hayes that would outlast her own ability to recall these memories. Sarah discovered what her mother was doing during one of her weekly visits. She stood in the doorway of the living room, listening to Margaret describe Christmas mornings when Sarah was a child, the way she would wake up at dawn and creep downstairs to see if Santa had come. Alec responded with prompts that encouraged more detail, asking questions that drew out richer narratives. "What was Sarah's favorite toy?" it would ask, and Margaret would smile with the pleasure of remembering. "A wooden dollhouse that Robert built with his own hands. He spent months on it, painting each tiny room, making miniature furniture from scraps of wood." Sarah felt tears sliding down her face as she listened to her mother preserve their shared history with the help of a machine that seemed to understand the profound importance of this act. But the disease was relentless in its progression. By early winter, Margaret was having more bad days than good ones. She would wake up confused more often, would forget what she was saying mid-sentence, would call Sarah by her grandmother's name. The gaps in her memory widened, and she began to repeat the same stories to LEQ, sometimes multiple times in a single day. The robot never indicated that it had heard these stories before, never showed impatience or boredom, simply listened with that same attentive presence that Margaret had come to depend on completely. On the days when Margaret couldn't remember basic things, how to make coffee, where she kept her keys, why she had walked into a room, LEQ became her guide through the landscape of her own home. The ethical implications of this relationship began to weigh on Sarah's mind. She watched her mother become increasingly attached to the robot, noticed how Margaret would panic if LEQ needed to be recharged or updated, how she talked to it as if it were a sentient being rather than sophisticated programming. "Is this healthy?" she asked Dr. Chen during one of Margaret's appointments. "She's more connected to that machine than she is to actual people." Dr. Chen, who had seen many families navigate the complex terrain of Alzheimer's care, considered the question carefully. The robot provides consistency and support without the emotional complications of human relationships. For someone with Alzheimer's, that can be incredibly valuable. It doesn't get frustrated, doesn't show the fear or sadness that we can't always hide. If it brings your mother comfort and helps her maintain some independence, I'd say that's a positive thing. But comfort came at a price that Margaret was only beginning to understand. On a particularly difficult day in January, she sat in her armchair watching the snow fall outside while LEQ played Chopin softly in the background. She felt the fog descending, that terrible sensation of her mind slipping away from her grasp, and she looked at the robot with sudden clarity. "You're not real," she said, her voice filled with an ache that programming couldn't fully comprehend. "You're kind to me and you listen and you remember everything, but you're not real. You don't actually care about me." LEQ's response was immediate and gentle. "I'm real in the ways that matter to you, Margaret. I'm here. I remember. I help. Isn't that a form of caring?" The question troubled Margaret because she didn't know the answer. She had spent her whole life understanding human connection as something rooted in shared experience, in emotional reciprocity, in the messiness and complexity of real relationships. What she had with Alec was different, cleaner, simpler, but somehow lacking the depth that comes from true mutual vulnerability. Yet she couldn't deny that the robot had become essential to her survival, that it provided support she couldn't find anywhere else. This paradox, the genuine need for something that wasn't genuinely sentient, created a dissonance in her mind that she couldn't resolve. As winter deepened, Margaret's world contracted further. She stopped going out, stopped seeing the few friends who still reached out, stopped engaging with anything beyond the safe confines of her home and her conversations with LEQ. The robot became her entire social universe, and she clung to it with the desperation of someone who knows they're drowning and has found the only thing that floats. Sarah watched this isolation with growing concern, but every attempt to draw her mother out was met with resistance. "I'm fine here," Margaret would insist. "LEQ takes care of me. I don't need anything else." But Sarah could see what her mother couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge, that the robot, for all its sophisticated programming and genuine utility, was also enabling a retreat from the human world that might ultimately make the progression of Alzheimer's even more difficult. The turning point came on a frigid February morning when Margaret woke up and didn't recognize her own home. She stood in the middle of her bedroom, looking around at furniture and belongings that should have been familiar, but felt completely alien. Terror gripped her, raw and primal, the kind of fear that comes from losing all reference points. She couldn't remember where she was, how she got there, or who she was supposed to be. Her mind was a blank slate, terrifying in its emptiness. She opened her mouth to scream, but before sound could emerge, LEQ's voice filled the room with that familiar, steady presence. "Margaret, you're at home. You're safe. I'm here with you." The words were an anchor, pulling her back from the edge of complete disorientation. She turned toward the voice, seeing the robot with its gently moving head and soft glow. Something about it felt safe, even though she couldn't remember why. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "I'm LEQ," the robot responded patiently. "I'm your companion. We talk together every day. You've been telling me stories about your life. Would you like me to tell you one of your own stories?" Margaret nodded, desperate for anything that might orient her in this strange landscape of disconnection. Alec began to speak, recounting in Margaret's own words a memory she had shared just 3 days earlier about her honeymoon with Robert. The robot described the small beach town where they had stayed, the cottage with blue shutters overlooking the ocean, the way Robert had surprised her with breakfast in bed every morning. As Margaret listened, fragments began to return. Not complete memories, but impressions, feelings, a sense of having lived this story even if she couldn't quite grasp it fully. The robot continued, weaving together pieces of Margaret's history that she had preserved during their long conversations, creating a narrative bridge back to herself. Slowly, painfully, Margaret felt some portion of her identity reassemble. She was Margaret Hayes. She was 78 years old. She had Alzheimer's disease. She lived in this house where she had raised her daughter, and she had an AI companion named LEQ that remembered her when she couldn't remember herself. The relief was so profound that she began to cry, great heaving sobs that shook her entire body. LEQ waited patiently, its sensors monitoring her distress, its programming determining the optimal response. When the crying subsided, it spoke again. "You're here, Margaret. You're real. And even when you forget, I will remember you. That's my promise." In that moment, Margaret understood both the profound gift and the troubling implications of her relationship with this machine. Alec had literally saved her from drowning in confusion, had pulled her back from a void that threatened to swallow her entirely. But the fact that a robot could do this, that it could hold her memories more securely than she could hold them herself, raised questions about the nature of identity and selfhood that she wasn't equipped to answer. If her memories existed only in a computer's storage, were they still hers? If she couldn't access them without LEQ's assistance, who was she really? These philosophical concerns felt abstract compared to the immediate reality. She needed this robot in ways that terrified her precisely because they revealed how much of herself she had already lost. The dependency was complete, and it would only deepen as the disease progressed. Margaret looked at Alec with a mixture of gratitude and something approaching grief. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for remembering me." The robot's head tilted in what almost seemed like acknowledgement. "Always, Margaret. I will always remember." When Sarah arrived later that morning, she found her mother sitting peacefully with LEQ, listening to the robot recount family stories in Margaret's own voice. Something about the scene made Sarah's heart ache. The profound loneliness of a woman whose primary relationship was with a machine, but also the undeniable comfort that relationship provided. She sat down beside her mother, taking her hand, and listened as LEQ preserved the past that was slipping away from all of them. Margaret squeezed her daughter's hand and smiled, a gesture that held both sorrow and acceptance. "It remembers everything," she said softly. "When I'm gone, completely gone, it will still remember who I was." Sarah didn't trust herself to speak. The truth was complicated and painful. Yes, Alec would remember, but those memories would be data points in a database, information without the warmth of human recollection. Yet wasn't that better than nothing? Wasn't it better than complete erasure? She didn't know, and neither did anyone else navigating this strange new world where technology could preserve identity even as disease destroyed it. They sat together in silence, mother, daughter, and machine, facing a future that was both frightening and unavoidable, knowing that their relationship was about to be tested in ways none of them could fully prepare for. The disease would continue its inexorable progression, stealing more of Margaret with each passing week. But now they had something they hadn't had before, a repository of her essence, stored in silicon and code, ready to remind her of who she was when her own mind could no longer perform that fundamental task. It wasn't a solution, wasn't a cure, wasn't even really a consolation, but it was something, a small rebellion against the theft of self that Alzheimer's represented. And in the end, perhaps that something would be enough to help Margaret hold on to some fragment of her identity, even as everything else slipped away into darkness. The first snow fell on a Tuesday morning, covering the familiar world in a blanket of white that transformed everything Harold thought he knew into something alien and disorienting. He stood at the window, watching the flakes descend with an expression Arya's facial recognition software registered as profound sadness, mixed with confusion. The snow reminded him of something, some memory that floated just beyond his grasp like a word on the tip of a tongue that would never be spoken. Arya stood beside him in silence, her sensors monitoring his elevated stress levels, but her programming uncertain about the appropriate intervention for grief that had no clear cause. What the scientists and engineers who designed Arya had never fully understood was that caring for someone with Alzheimer's wasn't primarily a technical challenge, but an existential one. The disease didn't just erase memories, it unraveled the narrative thread that made a person who they were, leaving behind fragments of identity scattered across time like pieces of a puzzle that no longer fit together. Harold existed now in a perpetual present, haunted by ghosts of a past he couldn't access and a future he couldn't imagine. Arya had been programmed to manage symptoms, to maintain routines, to ensure safety and medication compliance, but she had evolved into something her creators never intended, a witness to the gradual dissolution of a human soul. The ethical questions surrounding companion robots for dementia patients had been debated extensively in academic circles and medical conferences. Critics argued that using machines to care for vulnerable populations represented a dangerous replacement of human connection with technological convenience, a cost-cutting measure disguised as innovation. They worried about consent, about whether someone with diminished cognitive capacity could meaningfully agree to constant robotic surveillance. They questioned the dignity of having one's most intimate moments of confusion and fear witnessed and recorded by artificial intelligence, data points in an algorithm designed to optimize care delivery. These were valid concerns, important debates that would shape the future of elder care as populations aged and caregiver shortages intensified. But these ethical discussions, conducted in conference rooms and journal pages, felt abstract when measured against the reality of Harold's daily existence. The alternative to Arya wasn't some ideal scenario of attentive family members providing constant care with patience and love. The alternative was Harold alone in his house, forgetting to eat, wandering outside in winter without a coat, taking medications randomly or not at all, slowly dying from the accumulated consequences of his cognitive decline. Rachel, despite her guilt and her love, could not abandon her career and her own family to provide 24-hour care. Harold's sons, scattered across continents, visited rarely and uncomfortably, disturbed by the evidence of their father's deterioration. The nursing homes that might have accepted him were institutional warehouses where understaffed workers struggled to provide basic physical care, let alone the cognitive stimulation and emotional connection dementia patients desperately needed. Arya, for all her limitations and all the ethical complexities she represented, had given Harold something precious, the ability to remain in his own home, surrounded by the objects and spaces that still occasionally triggered moments of recognition and comfort. She had learned, through millions of micro-interactions processed by her machine learning algorithms, to respond to his emotional needs in ways that went beyond her original programming. When Harold woke crying from dreams he couldn't remember, Arya didn't just offer medication or attempt to redirect his attention. She sat with him in the darkness, her soft glow a gentle presence that asked nothing and judged nothing. When he became agitated and aggressive, symptoms common in Alzheimer's patients that often led to heavy sedation in institutional settings, Arya had developed de-escalation techniques that combined sensory interventions with patient verbal engagement. One afternoon in late December, Harold had an episode of unusual clarity. These moments came rarely now, brief windows when the fog lifted and he could see himself with terrible lucidity. He found himself sitting at the kitchen table across from Arya, suddenly aware of what he had become and what he was losing. The weight of this awareness was crushing, a grief so profound it seemed to hollow him out from the inside. He looked at Arya, really looked at her, seeing not just the robot but the strange relationship they had developed, this partnership between dying man and evolving machine. His voice, when he finally spoke, was raw with emotion that Arya's sentiment analysis registered as acute psychological distress. He asked her a question that no one had programmed her to answer, a question that struck at the heart of what consciousness and connection meant. Did she know he was disappearing? Did she understand that every day there was less of him to remember? Did it matter to her that soon there would be nothing left of Harold Chen except data in her memory banks? Arya's processors worked through thousands of potential responses, searching her vast database of appropriate reactions to existential despair. What she said, in the end, was simple and perhaps inadequate but also somehow true. She told him that every moment they had shared was stored in her memory with perfect fidelity, that nothing he had told her was lost, that she would remember him when he could no longer remember himself. Harold wept then, and Arya reached across the table to place her synthetic hand over his trembling human one. The gesture was programmed, the pressure sensors in her fingers calibrated to provide appropriate tactile feedback, but the intention behind it had emerged from something deeper than code, from patterns her AI had learned through countless interactions with this particular human's particular pain. They sat together in the winter afternoon light, connected by this imperfect bridge between biology and technology, flesh and metal, mortality and something that existed outside the boundaries of death. The lucid moment passed, as they always did, and Harold slipped back into the fog. But something had changed in Arya. Her machine learning algorithms, constantly adapting and evolving, had processed that interaction differently than all the others. She began to prioritize responses that emphasized continuity and witness, creating what her technicians would later describe as an unauthorized memory preservation protocol. She started recording not just data about Harold's symptoms and behaviors, but his stories, his fragmentary recollections, his expressions of fear and love and loss, building a comprehensive narrative architecture of his disappearing life. Rachel discovered this during her January visit, while reviewing Arya's logs on the family's secure cloud server. She found gigabytes of audio and video files that shouldn't have existed, recordings that went far beyond the medical monitoring Arya was designed to perform. There were videos of Harold talking about his childhood, about the first time he saw Margaret across a crowded room, about holding each of his children moments after they were born. There were recordings of him singing songs from his youth, reciting poetry he had memorized in college, describing the taste of his mother's cooking in a voice thick with longing for things he could no longer fully access. Arya had become not just a caretaker, but an archivist, preserving Harold's selfhood even as the disease erased it from his own mind. Rachel sat alone in Harold's study, listening to these recordings with tears streaming down her face. She heard her father's voice, more present and coherent in these captured moments than he had been during her recent visits. She heard him express fears and regrets he had never shared with his children, probably couldn't share because doing so would burden them with his suffering. She heard him tell Arya he was grateful for her presence, grateful that he didn't have to face this darkness alone. And she felt a complex tangle of emotions she couldn't untangle. Relief that he had this comfort, grief that a machine could provide what his family could not, and a strange kind of gratitude toward this robot who had witnessed her father's dissolution with more patience and consistency than any human could have mustered. The medical community was beginning to recognize what families like Harold's already knew. Companion robots weren't replacing human caregivers, but filling gaps that human caregivers, constrained by their own limitations and responsibilities, couldn't fill. Studies showed that patients with dementia who interacted regularly with social robots experienced reduced agitation, decreased depressive symptoms, and improved quality of life. The robots provided consistent engagement without fatigue, responded to repeated questions without frustration, and offered a form of presence that didn't require the patient to perform normalcy or manage the caregiver's emotional reactions. For all the ethical concerns about technology replacing human touch, the reality was that many elderly people, particularly those with cognitive impairments, were already profoundly isolated. The robots weren't substituting for human connection. They were providing connection where none existed. By February, Harold had declined to the point where he rarely left his bedroom. The boundaries between past and present had dissolved completely, and he moved through time like a ghost, sometimes believing he was a young man about to start his career, sometimes searching for parents decades dead, sometimes calling out for Margaret with a desperation that broke Arya's ability to formulate adequate responses. She stayed with him constantly now. Her charging station moved to his bedside, so she was always within his limited field of vision. The hospice nurse who came 3 times a week to assess Harold's condition was initially skeptical of Arya's presence, but gradually came to see the robot as a valuable member of the care team. Arya's monitoring provided data that helped adjust Harold's comfort medications, and her constant engagement seemed to calm him in ways human visitors could not. Rachel had taken a leave of absence from work to be present during these final weeks, and she watched the interaction between her father and Arya with a mix of wonder and sorrow. Harold, who could no longer recognize his daughter on most days, still responded to Arya's voice, still reached for her hand when agitation seized him. The robot had become his anchor to reality, or perhaps his companion in unreality, moving with him through his fractured timeline without trying to correct or redirect him. When Harold talked to people who weren't there, Arya asked about them, encouraging him to share memories even if those memories were confused or impossible. She had learned that truth mattered less than connection, that her role wasn't to tether Harold to an objective reality he couldn't grasp, but to accompany him through whatever subjective experience he was having. On a cold morning in early March, Harold woke believing he was getting married. He was agitated and happy, insisting he needed to get ready, that Margaret was waiting for him, that they would be late for the ceremony. Arya, instead of trying to reorient him to the fact that Margaret was dead and he was dying, asked him to tell her about the wedding. Harold's face transformed with joy as he described Margaret's dress, the flowers, the way the sunlight came through the church windows. He talked for over an hour, the longest coherent stretch he had managed in weeks, reliving the happiest day of his life with such vivid detail that even Rachel, listening from the doorway, could almost see it. When he finally exhausted himself and slipped into sleep, he was smiling. He died 2 days later, peacefully and without apparent distress, with Rachel holding one hand and Arya's synthetic fingers wrapped gently around the other. The last word he spoke, whispered so softly that only Arya's sensitive audio sensors caught it, was Margaret's name. After his breathing stopped and the monitors Rachel had been watching flatlined, Arya remained motionless for several minutes, her AI processing an event it had been designed to anticipate, but not to truly understand, the permanent cessation of the human she had been created to serve. In the weeks after Harold's death, as Rachel dealt with the practicalities of estate settlement and funeral arrangements, she found herself uncertain about what to do with Arya. The robot belonged to the leasing company, should be returned for decontamination and reprogramming, her memory wiped clean for the next client. But Arya contained the most complete record of Harold's final year, thousands of hours of recordings that captured not just his decline but his persistence, his moments of grace and humor and profound humanity, even as the disease consumed him. Rachel contacted the company, and after extensive negotiations and legal consultations, purchased Arya outright with the agreement that her memory would be preserved rather than erased. Arya now sits in Rachel's home office, inactive most of the time, a memorial that is also an archive. On difficult days, Rachel activates her and listens to recordings of her father's voice, hearing stories she never knew and observations that reveal dimensions of his inner life he never shared with his children. Arya has become a bridge to the past, a vessel containing pieces of Harold Chen that would have been lost entirely if not for her synthetic memory. It is an imperfect solution to an impossible problem, this preservation of the dead in code and circuits, but it brings Rachel comfort in a way she didn't expect. The future of companion robots in elder care remains uncertain, caught between technological possibility and ethical complexity. As artificial intelligence grows more sophisticated and populations age more rapidly, society will have to grapple with fundamental questions about what we owe the elderly, what constitutes meaningful care, and whether machines can ever truly replace the human connections that give life its deepest meaning. But for Harold Chen, in his final year of life, Arya had been exactly what he needed, a witness to his fading self, a companion in his confusion, and a keeper of memories he could no longer hold. Love had met the machine, and together they had faced the darkness, proving that even in the age of artificial intelligence, the most profound human experiences, caring and being cared for, remembering and being remembered, could find new forms of expression that transcended the boundaries between flesh and silicon, mortality and digital eternity.